Okay, for 10b, refer to the previous video 10a to get the formulas, but I'm just going to go ahead and fill these in. So the formula for a period is 2 pi over b. It's 2 pi divided by the number in front of the x. So 2 pi divided by 2 gives us pi for the period. For amplitude, it's the absolute value of the number in front of the trig function. In this case, it's going to be the absolute value of negative 1/2, which gives you positive 1/2. And then for the phase shift, it's opposite sign of this number divided by the number in front of the x. So opposite sign of negative will give you positive pi over 2. We're dividing that by 2, the number in front of the x. And if you flip and multiply, you'll get pi over 4 for that one. So that's the first information. Next thing we want to find is the quarter point. That gets us the next key points. We just keep adding them to the phase shift. The phase shift is always going to be one of your key points. Quarter point is equal to period divided by 4. So in this case, coincidental, but your quarter point happens to be the same as the phase shift. That's not always going to happen, but for this one it does. So here's how we find the other key points. You're going to take we start with the phase shift, so that's this one here. Then we're going to add the quarter point to it, and you'll get 2 pi over 8 or pi over 2 if you reduce it. Let's actually just leave it as pi over 8. You can reduce it, but on the test it's not necessary for you to reduce it. I'm actually just going to leave it as 2 pi over 4 because that way we got common denominators, make it easier to add all the way through. So we'll leave it as 2 pi over 4. Next we'll take 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4, and you get 3 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4 plus pi over 4 will give you 4 pi over 4. So again, this can reduce to 1, but I'll leave it with the denominator of 4. 4 pi over 4 plus pi over 4, you'll get 5 pi over 4. So again, you have to do it a total of 4 times because with the phase shift plus the 4, it'll give you the 5 key points. So I have pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3, 4, and 5 down to there. So with that, give you a chance to, you can stop the video to take that down. I'm going to erase it so you have room to graph it. So for the graphing, that's here. This starts here at pi over 4 and then it continues. So here's the other key points. So pi over 4, it was 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, and 5 pi over 4. Okay, so that was the other key points. Now, the amplitude is 1/2, and so if you just want to label it like that, we'll just do 1/2 and negative 1/2, we'll just do that. When you have a cosine graph, the graph begins at whatever number you have in front of the trig function. So at negative 1/2, it'll start right there at pi over 4. If this was a sine graph, I'd be starting it on the x-axis, but it's cosine, so we got to start it. So at the first key point, so not at 0, we got to start it at the phase shift that's there. We start it here. Next, it's going to move up to this one, 2 pi over 4. Then it'll go up to that one. Then back down to the x-axis again, and then back down to here. That's why you have these key points, because something happens. At every key point, it'll go from an amplitude down to the x-axis, amplitude again. So the graph itself will be a bell-shaped curve that's going to look something like this. If we check the period to make sure that makes sense, if you take 5 pi over 4 minus pi over 4, that would be 4 pi over 4 or pi, so it does make sense for our period, so this would be your completed graph.